Welcome back, Scott. Gonna dig deeper into fat burners. This week, I would like to kind of dig into something more along the lines that is used, sometimes abused, and most often misunderstood. Things like clenbuterol and growth hormone come into mind as number one and number two. Maybe some peptides, but I think that's a conversation for a completely different video, to be honest.
Mm.
And I would like to see your experience, your opinion, your insights about when would somebody use something like that. We know clenbuterol is basically a drug for somebody who suffers from asthma. Oftentimes people go like, "Oh, how long can I use it?" Well, like if you have asthma, forever. but it's
Yeah.
used for different purposes. Like one of the side effects is it might help you to burn some body fat. Is there some truth to it? If so, what is actually happening in the human body when that's included in the regime? And what are the upsides, downsides, what people need to be aware of, and so on and so forth?
Well, you're right. It's been used in medicine since the 70s for things like asthma, and other breathing issues. Not as much anymore, definitely not in North America as much anymore, but still parts of the world, still, that's one of the treatments. Um, in fitness, when we're getting into the use of clenbuterol, it does increase fat oxidation, and fat mobilization, actually. And it actually also seemingly has some hypertrophy effects as well. So it's a pretty useful tool in a lot of scenarios. Its most commonplace, or one of its most common places, is actually in track and field. It was being utilized there for its anabolic properties long before it became a fat burner in bodybuilding. Um, it's a stimulant just like ephedrine. If we remember last video, we talked about ephedrine. It's sort of a non-specific stimulation to the um, beta receptors, alpha and beta receptors. It's got a shorter half-life, 4 to 6 hours, something like that. With ephedrine, clenbuterol is a little bit more specific. It still is a beta 2 adrenergic receptor agonist like ephedrine, but it's mostly specified to target the beta 2 receptor. And it has a very long half-life, like 33, 35 hours. So it's a lot different when it comes to that in terms of how to use the drug, how often should you be implementing it, etc., versus ephedrine. But also because it's specifically targets the beta 2, it doesn't drive up certain things to the same extent ephedrine does. Like blood pressure and heart rate and all that aren't going to see the same increase as you would with ephedrine, but the effect of clenbuterol is going to last significantly longer with the half-life of 33 plus hours. So it is something to consider, yeah.
Is there anything that can either make it more effective or less effective? Like you were talking in the last video, if you mix your caffeine with ephedrine and your hembine or whatever, there's million mixtures that it can kind of synergistically get better results. Is clenbuterol something that can be used like that? Or maybe there is something that can enhance its negative side effects, which I would like you to mention as well. What are the downsides of this? Well, first of all, you kind of explain a little bit of the history of that and what it does, but how effective is this compared to ephedrine, caffeine, and himbine, and all those kind of things? Is this way more effective, or is this just another tool that's in comparison? You kind of, if then choose this, but if you can't do that, you can choose that. What's happening there? On effectiveness scale, compared to last video, what we were talking about, where would you rank this to, let's say, ephedrine?
It's going to be relatively similar from its fat mobilization oxidation effects as ephedrine. Probably a little better, but I think it's minimal if it is. Um, you're going to see a similar 10 to 20% increase in thermogenesis as you would with ephedrine. But clenbuterol is going to last longer. So that potentially could add up. You're not going to see, like I said, the same blood pressure buildup, the same heart rate increase as ephedrine, but you could still see sleep disturbances. It's still a stimulant. Normally, people notice jitterness, like they're shaky if they're taking too much, possible headaches, and like I said, the sleep disturbances, and even sometimes muscle cramps. There seems to be a little bit of correlation with hydration levels and clenbuterol, but all these things are individual. I find when I use it with clients, we treat the symptoms as they appear. There's not really a general consideration I make with ephedrine, or sorry, with clenbuterol, other than possibly a slight increase in fluids, just because there does seem to be muscle cramps and spasms that happen, and we're not really sure. We, as in, I don't know of anyone that knows, is it a fluid level change or an electrolyte switch or both? So typically what I do is, if the implementation of clenbuterol happens, we increase fluid intake ever so slightly, and that seems to deal with it very, very well. A synergy thing you could consider is sometimes the headaches that you get from clenbuterol, seemingly an increase in caffeine can help that. Why or how, I don't know. I think that would be a good question for somebody like Lyle or possibly Broderick. But that does seem to help with the headaches that are coming from clenbuterol. And then what can add to the synergy of clen is thyroid implementation, which is a whole new video. But typically what happens is people implement clenbuterol, they'll see a slight bump from their basal metabolic body temperature. And once that temperature sort of basically normalizes again, they introduce T3, and there's a synergy there when it comes to the fat mobilization and oxidation with clen. So it can be quite powerful. It's very common in females for fat loss, is the combination of clen with thyroid, specifically T3.
Interesting. So would you look in specific blood test results? Would you look for TSH, T4, T3? What would you look for somebody to not mess themselves up by adding thyroid hormone?
Anytime I'm going to be implementing or suggesting the implementation of thyroid, protocols of any sort, I'm always using blood markers first, just because I want to know what baseline levels look like. So anytime a client and I are working together, their baseline blood work from day one will include a thyroid panel, and then from there, how often we check it depends on what we're doing and what we're using, if anything. But before I would implement any exogenous thyroid use, I would have a thyroid panel done. And yeah, TSH is a helpful marker, but so is T4, T3, possibly reverse T3. Depending on the individual and their history, you might even want to be looking at antibodies. But the thyroid is a whole different topic. But if you were implementing T3, I'd want to know what T3 levels were prior to the implementation of it. And the thyroid, just the general health of the thyroid gland as it is before we even start to play with that stuff. The thyroid's usually pretty resilient. Anytime you add some sort of exogenous thyroid use and then remove it, the thyroid's bouncing back relatively quickly, a few weeks, maybe a little longer, and things are normally back to normal. There's also clen seems to increase the conversion of T4 to T3 at the liver, which is also part of its benefit. The things that clen seemingly do well, aside from the increase in the thermogenesis of the body, it seems to bias fats as a predominant fuel source as opposed to carbs. It also improves the conversion of T4 to D3 at the liver. So it has an ability to increase fat mobilization, increase fat oxidation, and also improve T3 markers. So all those things lead to more fat oxidation overall. And then from its anabolic point of view, it seems to have a bit of almost a inhibition on myostatin release. So you can think of myostatin as sort of the governor on muscle growth, like a brake, and clenbuterol seems to inhibit that a little bit. So it does a lot of things. It's used in cattle to increase the size, like livestock, from its hypertrophy effects. So it's a pretty useful tool, like I say, especially in females. But it's like you mentioned at the beginning, it's very, very commonly abused. Probably one of the most abused drugs.
What are the most common problems you see with that? Is it using it at too high of doses? Is it using it too long, or is it mixed in with a million other things and not understanding what it actually does? I also have a million questions about like other sides, but let's dig into this first. What are the most common, let's say, mistakes that you see being in use of clenbuterol?
Um, I don't know. I would say the most common thing that I personally see is just people just using too many things all at once, not understanding the synergy between them. They just take the common drugs that people are prescribed, or especially for females. It's going to be clenbuterol, Anavar, T3, and it almost seems as though, oh, and of course a low carb diet. It almost seems as though it's the starting blueprint for a female competitor or a female um, interested in getting leaner. This is your protocol. It's going to have Anavar, clenbuterol, T3, and low carb. So right off the bat, like if we know that clenbuterol has the ability to increase the conversion of T4 to T3, you also need carbohydrates for that conversion. So they're giving you clen, they're taking away your carbs. Like there's always this just a smelting pot of crap that's all thrown at them all at once. And of course it's going to work because drugs work no matter what. But really nobody's paying attention to the intricacies and the synergies between certain things. And you could get away with a lot less, or maybe a lot less total dosage, or even less compounds in general. So I think the biggest mistake I see is abuse, in the sense that they just take anything and everything and they run high dosages where they don't need to, and or they run them too long. Oftentimes you'll see like, okay, it's a 12-week prep. Where I live, 12-week prep was like the Bible. 12-week prep, 12-week prep. Nobody was lean enough to be in a 12-week prep. But right from day one, you'd start with clen, Anavar, low carb, and go from 12 weeks out. So really, you're just throwing everything at it all at once and just drugging your way and starving your way to the body composition that you end up with. And I think all those things can be done so much better. There's so many rooms for improvement there.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's we live in information age, and it seems like that information is so abused that the famous word misinformation gets out all
Yeah.
the time. But I feel I was just lucky that I was born in a place where the information was very, very limited. And at the same time, people were very risk aware. If you do something, you try to read about it as much as you can first before you put your hands onto something. Whereas now everyone is just going to the person with IFBB Pro next to their name or whatever, and they must know what they do, when clearly majority of them have no idea what they're doing. When like
Yeah, there's an IFBB Pro, famous IFBB Pro female coach in my area who is constantly rebranding herself because she's constantly selling bullshit. And so it can only last so long, and if you actually took the time to go back and it's all been deleted, I'm sure, but from day one, she was on every single bandwagon trend and just milked everyone for their money, from the keto to the, high intensity to the low carb to the whatever it was. And they just keep rebranding because the internet allows them to. And there's so many people, shopping on the internet, that once you rebrand yourself and change everything and erase the past, most people aren't paying attention or no.
yeah,
It's
it's much
unfortunate.
easier to do it in North America, that's for sure. So in Europe, people are a bit more skeptical about everything. So they're like, okay, where
Good.
we came up with this stuff. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's like, it's so easy to be called doctor in America. And I'm like, so you only need to do these things. You need to do basic undergraduate study, and a couple years later you're a doctor. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, whatever. But can I touch up on how important is nutrition when using clenbuterol? So you touched up that there might be an issues with cramping. Is it as easy as just using extra water, extra electrolytes, or is there maybe some kind of foods that you feel like is missing that might alleviate that as well? Or is there any kind of nutritional strategies that helps you to make clenbuterol more effective? Is it just cutting out carbs, or is there any kind of source of foods that you would prefer for anyone to use when using this supplement?
Um, that's an interesting question, and not to kind of dodge it, but to be perfectly honest, I find that if the nutrition protocol is set up what what I consider properly in the beginning, I don't see these issues coming up. And so I can't say, is it because of this mineral or this nutrient or whatever, but I think just common sense tells me that that is why. If people are depriving their body from certain nutrients because they're constantly in an energy deficit, um, there's no way to know what's going on. I mean, it could be something as simple as your food is lacking enough calcium, and that's part of the issue when Clen is introduced. Um, but if the food is adequate, and it should be, like we've preached about this now in how many videos? If I'm giving you all the food you can possibly take in without gaining body fat, I know that we have the capacity now to start playing with these things. If you're just using a drug to kind of bridge a gap every time or band-aid a wound, you're going to run out. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. So I find that if the protocols of nutrition are set up, I don't see these issues. When it comes to the cramping and stuff with clenbuterol, I don't know if it's the increase of hydration and the change in electrolytes, but I do implement that when I implement Clen, and the muscle cramps go away. So I don't have the exact mechanism as to why. I just know that Clen in, hydration and electrolytes up, and issue gone. So why that is, I don't know. And that's even when there's adequate calories already in play. Now, if there's a major deficit in place, I think you're going to find you have to supplement even harder. But that's just because with low calories, you're just running the risk of more nutrient deficiencies. And I think at the end of the day, that's the biggest miss, maybe not miss, most underrated issue is that if you're depriving the body of essential minerals, you're going to run into all kinds of issues, and then trying to figure out what is the cause is very difficult because there's just so many underlying factors at that point.
Something you mentioned before is that clenbuterol might help with muscle retention, maybe even muscle growth. And I have observed this a lot with very high level professional bodybuilders that they will use clenbuterol for muscle gaining, so to speak, phase. So is this also effective for fat loss at maintenance calories?
Yeah, it is, because if we take somebody at maintenance calories where theoretically their body weight, body composition, everything is staying the same, hence maintenance, then the introduction of Clen is going to increase CAMP, HSL, which is going to increase fat mobilization, and then therefore fat oxidation if you're being active or whatever. So right away you get an increase in fat oxidation by introducing Clen. I think you can get up to 20% with something like 80 micrograms and above. Now, I don't go to the threshold of 80 micrograms right off the bat. I like to suggest people take whatever they're using based on body weight. So typically, what I find, what I've learned over the years, what seems to be the case is about half a microgram per kilo is a good place for muscle retention and possible muscle gain. And then if I want to get the most of the fat oxidation mobilization effect of Clen, I'm doubling that, probably going up to a microgram per kilo. Now, if I have a bikini athlete, she's probably only 60 kilos, give or take 65, something like that. So I don't need to necessarily jump right up to 80, though the study says that you can. But if I'm getting the fat loss from 60, I don't see the point in going to 80. So I'd rather titrate up than just right away throw 80 at somebody. But absolutely, the introduction of cleanse seems to increase fat oxidation and possible muscle retention, even at maintenance calories. And you're no longer at maintenance calories when the thermogenesis is increased 10 or 20%. It's essentially like taking away 10 or 20% of your calories.
So it's almost not as much as just fat loss agent. It's more like body recomposition agents that could be used in off season, so to speak, to just make sure you don't get way out of shape.
I
Is
like the use of it in bridges. So if I have, especially with females, because we know females are so sensitive to androgens, we don't want a female to be living on an anabolic androgenic steroid if she has any concerns of virilization or masculinization, and most of them do. So because of that, we don't want to be living on AAS use all the time. We want to limit it as much as possible, to accomplish the goal. So when the AASs are not being used, I think Clen is a great alternative because it's not playing on the sex hormone pathways, which gives them a break from that. So it's not causing any risk of virilization or masculinization, other than potentially muscle gain, which some people could consider to be masculinizing. But the amount of muscle you're going to gain from clenbuterol, it shadows in comparison to, say Anavar or Nandrolone or any anabolic steroid. It's not going to be anywhere near the same. So what I like to use it for is in the bridge period where anabolics are out, Clen is in, for hypertrophy or muscle retention even. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm wanting to use it for fat loss, though I could. But if I'm using clenbuterol just for its muscle growth properties, I'm using it when anabolics are not there. If anabolics are there, I don't need Clen unless I'm trying to get more fat loss results from something. If I have to incorporate AAS use and Clen at the same time, usually that's because the timeline's a little on the tight side and you're trying to get as much fat loss as you can. But I'd rather separate them. But there's nothing wrong with combining them if you need to. But again, it's the right tool for the job. It's always that.
So just to kind of narrow it down, everything that you described for somebody who's like trying to follow up through on that was the clenbuterol does not affect your sex hormones, so there
No.
won't be side effects of anything growing wrong places.
No.
Also, those kind of
Right. Yeah. No. There'll be no larger clit or 5 o'clock shadows coming from clenbuterol.
Yeah. Which we sometimes see that bikini girl suddenly loses her voice or has to start shaving or whatever, and you're like,
Yeah.
it wasn't worth it. Following up on that, because of the long half-life, you already said it might impair your sleep. How can you minimize those disturbances of sleep? Is there anything how would you even use it? Do you use it every day? Do you use it every day and a half, or because of the half-life? What is the best approach for somebody? Is there any kind of things that you would monitor to figure out the sweet spot for every person individually?
Yeah, and that's a good question. How I implement Clen is depending on body weight. Typically, you're going to find 40 microgram tablets or something along those lines. So typically what I do when I'm working with females, because they're usually smaller in general, I typically have them cut it in half and they're taking 20. And because of the 33, 35-hour half-life, I'll say take 20 depending on their sensitivity to stimulants, which I would know because we would have talked about that. But let's just say, they're coffee drinkers and, stimulants is not a big deal. I would start with 20 and I would keep it at 20 for a couple days in a row before going to 40 to let that half-life accumulate. Usually around 3 to 5 times the half-life is when you're going to get to that steady plasma level. So around the 3rd or 4th day, the effects of 20 is going to be showing you what it can do. If you right away just start going 20 on Monday, 40 on Tuesday, 60 on Wednesday, before you even experience all of the power that 20 gave you, you already have doubled it and tripled it. And by the time it's, reaches steady plasma levels, you could have jitters and be shaking. I had a hairstylist use it one time and didn't follow that protocol and upped it a little bit too quickly and had to stop because it was hard to, hold the scissors when you're doing one of these. But it depends on the individual. I've had some females that just don't like it because of that. I've have more females than not that love it because it's very convenient. They like how they feel. Their workouts are usually better because of the stimulatory effect. And it works. It works very well. Now you have to be careful because it's a banned substance. So obviously, where you get it, where you live, that's also something to consider. But it definitely can work quite effectively. And like you said, it's going to minimize the potential side effects of anabolic steroids that some women are fearing, like a mustache or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's a great things that you just mentioned, that jitters doesn't mean it works or it doesn't work. If you don't have them, that doesn't mean you're wasting your time. It's just a side effect of you going a little bit overboard, and some people like that just because psychologically now they acknowledge it's working
Yeah.
there. From what I see, when people have that feeling, they actually work out even harder because they don't want
Mm-hmm.
to waste this opportunity, so to speak, where in reality it always works at any capacity.
Jitters means it's working, but like you say, you don't have to have the jitters for it to be working either. And I agree with you. That's a problem that I see is a lot of people are trying to feel the drug. There's nothing to feel. We actually don't want some of these effects. It would be better if you didn't notice them, but placebo is very powerful. And yeah, people will take oral anabolic steroids as a pre-workout because they think that is what needs to happen. There are certain oral anabolic steroids that could be used before an event or something like that, but not all of them. Usually, that's not the purpose. But people take that, they think this and feel this way, and they train accordingly. So that's
I
sort of
see
that,
it very often
science and
in a
practicality.
strongman community. I think that's where it comes from. In a strongman community, is that you take this very powerful thing before, and it's gonna make you feel. And we both know it's just a placebo, anyways. It doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
So it's not
Yeah,
exactly.
and the placebo is powerful, and that's where you kind of bridge this scientific and practicality, uh, you know, debate, and eventually the compliance has to trump. So if you think it's working and it makes you train harder, then who am I to say no?
Well, yeah, it's like having a pre-workout now. You can have it with caffeine or with no caffeine, and if you just drink colorful juice before training, you think you're going to train
Yeah,
harder, and you do train
yeah,
harder. Uh, but
yeah,
it's
right.
with everything, right? It's whatever you do. If there is a like athletes are superstitious or whatever, they put their right sock first and whatnot, and that makes them perform better. So this is kind of on a similar level. Work it up on this. I'm pretty sure we're just gonna go and pull apart Clan and maybe do GH in separate video.
Sure.
Because what I would like to do is more in-depth stuff about when is it too much of a good stuff? When do you know that people have done way too much clenbuterol, if even it's such a thing? Because you mentioned kind of touched about like it can give a little bit of anxiety and stuff like that. Is there Can there be such a psychological effect that it literally distracts them from training? Because that's probably one of the most important parts, that you use some kind of supplement for fat burning, but you still need to do activity for the best results possible. Can you overdo it to the point where people just like, you know what, I feel too anxious to even go to the gym now? Have you ever heard of anything like that?
I have heard of that, but not from Clen in isolation. So I'm sure it could be done, but I think you'd be taking that dosage and ramping that up wildly past the microgram per kilo. Um, I see that more often in yohimbine than in Clen, but I mean, all these stimulants can cause an increase in anxiety. If someone is predisposed to anxiety already, I would be a little bit more cautious. I would maybe do things a little slower, maybe a little lower dose. But I think you can always have too much of anything. But the way that I implement Clen with my clients, we know if you like Clen or you don't right away. And if you don't, we don't consider it anymore. If you do, I still use it in a very strategic way. It's not like you get to go on it and stay on it forever. I don't think that's a very wise move. But I also don't think it's necessary. So I would much rather use it, implement it in a certain way. Like, are we using it for muscle growth and or retention, or are we using it for fat burning properties? And if so, what does that time frame look like? I'm a big proponent of knowing the date of the end goal and backtracking, like we've talked about before. I want to know, okay, I've got 16, 20, 24 weeks, whatever I have. Where do I feel is best to implement these different strategies? And very rarely, aside from some sort of potential medicinal use, does one thing go in and stay there static forever. That's just not the way I do things, unless it's literally needed for day-to-day living, like a replacement hormone replacement therapy, for example. I wouldn't just cycle someone off of it if they literally needed it. But with Clen, there's better drugs for asthma. So if in North America, if someone has asthma, we're not using Clen to treat it, though we could use it to benefit it to some degree. I would still not use Clen as the sole reason to treat asthma. So for that reason, it's going to be kind of implemented strategically. And usually with females, I like it for the muscle retention, potential anabolic muscle building aspect of it when we don't use milligrams of steroids. If I have a female that doesn't use steroids, again, it becomes more powerful. I don't think it's ephedrine and Clen. I don't think they're that great as fat burners. I mean, they're good, but because there's not a lot of options. But I mean, a 10% increase, it's not nothing, but I would much rather just change the caloric intake. It's a lot easier. It's a lot more efficient than popping a drug. I'd be utilizing the fat burning properties of things like ephedrine and clenbuterol when the restriction of calories starts to pose a problem of nutrient deficiencies. So before I start dipping below, I don't know, say 1,300 calories on a female, we're going to be using an energy deficit via caloric restriction and or energy output to get the fat loss that we're looking for, not just implement Clen right away. Once I'm at that threshold where possibly the caloric intake is getting to a point where I might run deficiency issues, then we start looking at other things like ephedrine and or Clen or and or yohimbine, etc. Because I feel it's just a little bit more better for longevity. Less drugs to me is always better if they're not needed. And it's just an easier way to manage everything.
On touching back up on the half-life and how long it actually works, does it matter when you actually take it, since it's still stimulant? Do you take it at the beginning of the day or middle of the day or in the night? Because it seems like 33 plus hours. It sounds like it doesn't matter when you take it, but is there benefit of taking it early in the day?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that when you brought that up. So yeah, I have them implement, like I said in the beginning, I titrate them up every few days until we figure out what dose is best for them. But I have them take it first thing in the morning just because we want to have as much time between the taking of the drug and when they go to bed. It's possible that it's going to disrupt sleep. That is one of the things it does. But if it's disrupting sleep, if you take 20 micrograms at 6 a.m., you don't go to bed till 10 p.m., and it's for sure Clen is disturbing your sleep, it's probably best to just not use it. But I have not found that with any of my clients ever. When we implement it first thing in the morning and we've titrated the dose accordingly, their sleep is not affected. But it is something to consider. The longer time between the implementation of the drug and bedtime is a good strategy for any stimulant.
Would there be something that you would suggest to use for better sleep at the end of the day, if that is a thing? Or would you just tell them, hey, this is not for you?
Uh, Sleep is probably 1,000 videos worth of information. I think sleep first starts with lifestyle. Everybody by this point everybody knows sleep hygiene, right? We know we want a dark room, we want a cold room, we want blue lights out of the way, we want stimulants out of the blood, blah, 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 blah. That's all very, very well understood. But I think that the lifestyle is that foundation still. It's the first thing. You establish a lifestyle, you reduce your stress wherever you can, you are active, you're eating appropriately, like you're doing all the healthy things that you should be doing. And then you establish a sleep wake cycle. The wake part being more relevant, that should be very, very consistent. And then from there, it starts to depend. What's causing the sleep disruptions? If you're taking Clen, I wouldn't automatically then say, okay, now you have to take this to go to bed. Because if you take Clen and you're not having sleep disturbances, I wouldn't bother taking anything. But if we're looking to supplement sleep, I would, again, like everything else, I would start low and easy and work your way up to what's working. So possibly what you'll want to do, if you've done all the sleep hygiene bullet points, maybe look at supplementing something like lavender or lemon balm or maybe melatonin. But you're kind of going from the OTC super safe lemon balm or lavender to the OTC relatively safe melatonin, and you just start implementing these things and give them a chance. Possibly you need to supplement magnesium. Maybe you've run deficiencies in magnesium from being in a caloric deficit. It kind of depends. But I have never, and I don't think I ever will, say, you take this drug, now you must take this because this will cause that. I will make them aware of the potential causes of things and then say, if we see that, we will attack it with this. But it's not like take this, now take that right away. It's kind of like people that take testosterone right away take an AI with it. Well, what if you don't need the AI? It doesn't make any sense. So I'd rather always do less. Less is more to me, and then implement things as they're needed because you just have a better control and understanding of what causes what.
Awesome, Scott. Well, I'm mindful of your time. I'm going to let you off, and next week, let's touch up on growth hormone.
Yeah, that sounds great.